my talk. Here we go. He said he living life as a gringo, where you question where you fit in every time you mingle. They say you do this with not enough that. My rapping is really bad. This life as a gringo.
Yes, hello and welcome to another episode of Life as a Gringo. I am Dramos, of course. And man, we've been trying to put this episode together for a minute now. I'm really excited to bring this conversation to the show. And it's been one that just scheduling wise, we haven't been able to work it out, but I'm really happy that we finally got to. And my guest today is Lianne Torres, who's the host of the Watch Us Thrive podcast. And her basically life's work, you know, she is a survivor of domestic violence, and she has made it her life's work to have conversations around this, you know, this really sort of unspoken about, dare I say, epidemic that plagues our society, you know. And I think as a man, and I think probably generally with our culture, but as a man, I'm very ignorant to just how common things like this are. You know, I only really hear about it if it's somebody that is close to me that has been directly affected by it and they share their story with me. But it's not something that I feel like I'm keenly aware of. And I think a part of that is our sort of hush-hush culture around these types of things. But also, you know, I think it's just not widespread spoken about for as common of an occurrence as it is, right? And on this show, you know, I always like to try and have a wide array of conversations, you know, of people who are not getting the platform that they deserve or feel like an outsider in some sort of way, right? And obviously I can only sort of speak to my assumption of the feelings, and we'll obviously get into Lianne's story, but I can imagine how lonely it must be to go through something like this in a society, in a culture that really isn't very sensitive to this idea or doesn't really have, I think, enough resources for people who go through domestic violence, right? Adequate resources or adequate education, if you will, even, right? And I'm excited to just bring this conversation here, especially when it's somebody from our community, when there are, I think, so many nuances about our community that maybe sort of only contribute to the circumstances or why it's not shared about, why it's not talked about, right? So I'm just in general excited to bring this conversation because I think it's probably going to be very relatable for a lot of people and hopefully make a lot of people feel seen. But I think even beyond just the specific case of domestic violence, the lessons that Lianne speaks about are applicable to any of us, right? Regardless of gender, regardless of life experience, the lessons and work that Lianne has done since going through this horrendous experience, going through her own story of domestic violence, it's really a journey of somebody finding themselves after a really dark period, of somebody building the relationship with themselves, of holding the mirror up to themselves and saying, where are the patterns occurring in my life that I keep sort of allowing certain types of people to be in my orbit, or inviting certain types of people or behavior or whatever it might be, right? And again, that's applicable to all of us, right? We all have a tremendous amount of work to do in terms of self-love and in terms of being accountable for the situations we might find ourselves in, right? And obviously it's a balance, particularly when we talk about something like this. There is a abuser who is in fact responsible for the abuse. But as Lianne talks about, there's also a level of accountability or self-work or reflection that is a part of the healing process to say, what role did I play in this particular situation, right? How did I even find myself in the midst of somebody who was, you know, incredibly abusive, right? And again, that's not to victim blame, but I think there's something incredibly empowering when we can look at any negative situation outside of even this circumstance, but any negative situation that any of us go through, even if it's not our fault, where can we learn something from it? I think is the beautiful, I think, an empowering mindset to be able to develop as well. So again, I'm excited to bring this conversation here to the podcast, and I think there are so many gems in it, so many lessons that, again, regardless of if you relate to her story on a direct, specific basis, these are lessons around dating, around self-love, around identity and validation, and all these different things, right, that we all struggle with on a regular basis. So I really am excited to bring this conversation. I think that everybody's going to get something out of it. So without further ado, let's have our conversation with Lianne Torres as a part of our Mi Gente segment. Mi Gente. All right, so my guest today is the host of the Watch Us Thrive podcast, Lianne Torres, and she's just really made it her life's work to talk about something that is so, I feel like, underreported, so not just spoken about in our society for how often it actually occurs, right? The amount that it actually happens to people versus how much it's actually spoken about is there's obviously a huge deficit there, right? And Lianne has her own story of being a survivor of domestic violence, has made it her life's work, as I said, for being an advocate. And I'm just curious, kind of like from your perspective, describing sort of this work that you do and why it's so important.
It's something that so many of us are experiencing, but we don't talk about it enough. The numbers in America are staggering. 1 in 3 women will be a victim of domestic violence in their lifetime. And it does affect other people like men and trans and whatever, but predominantly it is women. And when I heard that number, I was like, holy shit, so many people are going through this, yet we're not talking about it because, like you said, it is so hush hush, so taboo. So I'm here to put it in people's faces, to hopefully start the conversation, to let people know what you're going through is not normal.
Yeah, and that's so powerful. And I love, kind of even you sharing a bit of your own backstory. I mean, I can only imagine, it's a difficult thing to go through in general, but you talk about you went through this experience of being, a survivor of domestic violence during COVID, when we're all basically trapped in general, right? And I'm sure, many of the stories you hear from people who are survivors of this talk about the idea of sort of feeling trapped in the situation, not knowing how to get out of it. But you quite literally were experiencing while the world was shut down. You couldn't sort of go and be around your loved ones, essentially, right, on a daily basis, or just get out of the house to escape it all, right? I'm curious, for you, what was sort of your aha moment that kind of gave you the strength to get out of that situation and move on with your life, essentially?
My aha moment was literally a life or death situation. So I talk in great detail on my own podcast if you want to hear the full story of what I went through in that relationship. But it was the night of March 12th, 2021, when my ex-boyfriend almost killed me, to be very blunt and frank. It was the worst abuse that I've ever gone through. And I literally escaped from my apartment after dealing with just a lot of bad shit. Yeah. Again, if you want to listen to the whole thing, you can listen to that episode. We'll link it in the show notes for you guys. Yeah. But it was in that moment of me listening to my intuition, that inner voice that all of us have, and especially us women. But something told me in that moment, if I don't leave, I'm not going to make it out. Yeah. And I'll never forget the words that he said to me. They replay in my head all the time. But he literally said to me, it doesn't matter what you say or do, you're not going to make it out of this apartment alive. Wow. And after I heard that, I don't know if it was God, if it was my angels, if it was just me like having my oh shit moment. Yeah. But that was when I realized I have to get out of here. And I literally escaped from my apartment. I went to one of my best friend's apartment at the time. I was living in Florida when this happened. Uh-huh. And when I showed up at her house, it was like 1:00 in the morning. Banging on the door like I'm the police. Yeah. She sees me, and that was the first time that I actually spoke up and told someone what was going on. And that really was the catalyst of me starting my journey to healing, leaving that relationship, all of that. But yeah, it was a life or death situation for
Wow.
sure.
Wow, that's so scary. And you touching on the idea of like the first time you actually opened up about it, right? Was when you were escaping, right? And I don't know what it necessarily is, but it feels like, especially I can speak to my own experience, but our community, we oftentimes don't talk about things, right? We hold a lot in. There's sort of this sense of pride that you don't want to admit, being wrong, or you don't let other people into your business, this whole type of thing, right? And I've noticed for you, you've spoken about the power in sharing your truth, right? And I'm curious, how you were able to kind of get to that point of being vulnerable, right? Because I'm sure you're talking about, you went through this whole experience, and it wasn't until you literally were escaping, from imminent death that it was you then telling somebody about it, right? So how does one make that transition to being so scared to speak on it to now exposing yourself to all of social media and all that comes along with it?
Yeah. It's been a journey.
Sure.
Let's just say that.
Yeah.
It's not something that, like, the next day I was like, you know what? I'm going to start a podcast and tell
Yeah.
everyone what I went through, right?
Right.
It took a lot for me first to accept that this was my reality, really hitting my rock bottom moment,
Yeah.
and then realizing that I could not heal from this on my own. So that's when I started to use my voice to ask for help.
Yeah.
And that looked like going to therapy, that looked like going to group therapy, that looked like working with life coaches, that looked like really sitting in my shit and realizing that this is a situation that I found myself in.
Uh-huh.
Not that I take responsibility for what he did, but there is some sort of accountability that I do take on what I allowed
Sure.
to happen in that relationship. And that's really hard, right?
Yeah.
And that's something that Bren knows I talk about a lot on the show, like taking responsibility over what I chose to deal with. And then, after doing that for a few months, I also work for my sister, who's a very successful podcaster. And I was doing a lot of the behind the scenes stuff for her. And learning the ins and outs of the podcasting world, I realized, I have a story. I have something here. And I feel like I've done enough inner work within myself to be able to put it out there for people to listen to. And I decided on January 1st, 2022, I recorded my first episode. It sounds terrible, y'all, but you got to start from zero.
Sure.
And I put it out there. And, just the feedback that I got from people that I knew in my personal life, but also strangers on the internet, the amount of positive feedback that were like, oh my God, me too.
Right.
And that blew my mind because, again, like we said in the beginning, this is such a taboo subject. This is something that we don't talk about enough. And when I was in it, I felt so alone.
Yeah.
I felt so ashamed. I felt so embarrassed, so hurt that I didn't speak up. But then when I put my story out there and other people could relate, I knew that there was something that had to be done. And that was me to continue talking about it.
Yeah.
And what am I, 134 episodes later? We're still here. We're still doing it.
Wow. Yeah. And it's so funny. I mean, I obviously have a different experience, but I found myself empowered when I began to sort of just speak my truth and be unafraid of judgment from other people or who is going to listen and who is going to have an opinion, all these different things. And
Right.
because like I said, I grew up in that space where we didn't talk about our problems outside of it, right? Everything was very hush hush. That's how I grew up as a kid. And I carried that into my adult life, right? Showing any vulnerability was a sign of weakness, And for me, as I've begun to share and be vulnerable with the world, essentially, right? I've noticed that it's creeped into other parts of my life where I'm far more confident and really showing up as myself. And to that point of what we started on, there is something so healing about sharing your truth and kind of what you were alluding to as well. The idea that you're not as alone as you think you are, right? And that's sort of, I think, guess what you kind of came to once you started getting some of that feedback from people when you were putting out those initial episodes.
Yeah, absolutely. It was crazy to me that, I was reaching people from all over the world. There was this one woman that reached out to me in my DMs on Instagram from the UK.
Wow.
I'm like, I don't know anyone from the UK. And
Yeah.
because I shared my story, she found me and she was like, oh my God, me too. And that right there, like, that's the why. It's not about the numbers. It's not about the metrics. It's not about getting your followers up or anything like that. Like, you need to remember why it is that you started. And for me, It's because I want people to know that you don't have to suffer in silence. You can take your power back by simply talking about the shitty things that you've gone through. And it doesn't need to be like you go through this and that's the be all end all.
Right.
And that's just your entire story. You know, that's just a little chapter of my life, but I've been able to turn it around into something so beautiful. And I want to empower other people to be able to do the same with whatever trauma that they've gone through, because we all have some shit,
Yeah.
right? We all have things that we're healing from, going through. Life is always lifing, but you know, it's in these groups, in this connective energy, that we're able to share our stories and help others feel seen, heard, and understood.
Yeah, no, absolutely. And one thing I love is you're obviously not removing any blame from your ex for what they did to you, but you're also saying to yourself, okay, what could I have done to not find myself in that particular situation, right? And I think that's incredibly powerful, because I think, you know, we're often scared to hold the mirror up to ourselves as well, right? And also in sensitive sort of cases like what we're talking about, you know, domestic violence, you don't want to make anybody feel, you know, guilty for something that, you know, at the end of the day is truly like this other person really being a terrible person, right? You know, even if there is some responsibility to be taken, it's a fine line to walk, I guess is what I'm trying to say, right? So I think, you know, how do you sort of, while finding that healing and not letting the other person off the hook for their actions, how do you also, I guess, find the strength to say to yourself, how do I learn from this, essentially, right? I mean, that's so empowering to begin with, is you even being able to have that perspective. I mean, how does one get there and move from a place of being a victim to then being a survivor?
Yeah, I will say, again, this has been a process, right?
Yeah.
In the beginning, it was fuck you, I hate you,
Sure.
you know, all of the things that's normal to feel in the beginning. But like I said before, the first step when it comes to healing, in my personal opinion, is accepting what it is. And I really had to look in the mirror and reflect on my own relationship patterns when it came to being in these types of abusive relationships.
Sure.
I have a very long history of dealing with shitty men, period, point blank, right? Sure. And it wasn't until my life was almost taken from me that I finally took a step back and was like, hold up, we're 3 for 3 now, right? Like, this is my third serious relationship. Excuse me, my third serious relationship, and I feel like I'm back at square one again. What is going on? And that's something that I talk about a lot, is that I came to a realization that the common denominator in every single one of these relationships was me.
Yeah.
You know, while every single person was different, the relationship dynamics were different, but it was still toxic in some way.
Sure.
And I had to really look and realize there's something about me that is attracting these type of people into my life. Like I said before, what he did, that's on him. I will never take responsibility for him trying to kill me.
Yeah.
But I do have to take responsibility for what I was lacking within me. And I came to the realization that there was a lack of love for myself. I didn't trust myself. I had no sense of self-worth, zero confidence, codependent as fuck. Like, that was my middle name. And I hated the thought of being alone. And that's the wound that I have to, and I'm still working through, right? Sure. This is a lifelong journey. Even though it's been three and a half years, I've done a lot of work, but there's still a lot more work left to be done. But the fact that I'm self-aware of it now, as opposed to the Lianne from before, who would just numb out, who would jump from one relationship to the next, who would smoke her life away, drink her life away, party her life away, do all these things to not feel the actual feelings. It was time for me to sit in my shit. And I think that's the part that's so difficult for a lot of us when it comes to healing from whatever thing that you're going through. Actually sitting in the pain, sitting in the hurt, sitting in the heartbreak, sitting in the anger, the resentment. That shit is hard. We don't want to do that, right? But that is where the work needs to be done, so we don't repeat the same patterns in the next relationship, in the next friendship, at the next job, whatever it is. So, you know, it's really just accepting the shit that I put myself through, and then starting to learn new patterns and new techniques to okay, let's not do this again because we know what happened when I did this.
Right.
Let's try that instead.
Yeah, no, absolutely. And you're touching on a couple of things I really want to get into, like conversations about, I know you're big on building a relationship with self, right? And then also even something I saw on your social media, sort of not falling in love with somebody's potential, basically, right, is how I would word it, right? So those are two, I think, huge things that correlate when it comes to romantic relationships, but also friendship, business partners, bosses, coworkers, whatever it might be, right? So I want to get to all that, but I'm going to pause here. We're just going to take a quick break for some commercials, and then we'll be right back. All right, we are back, and I touched on a couple things I really want to get into with you. Something I'm genuinely obsessed with, and that's why I want to really get into it, because you touched a nerve with that, is the relationship with self, right? Because I know for me, I had to come to that realization recently of I just kind of keep filling the void, with the next person, essentially, right? Whenever I get out of a relationship or a situationship, whatever it might be. And I'm just and then I get bored, I move on to the next thing, and I'm in this endless cycle of really just, very superficial connections with people, right? And it's the same kind of situation. I have to look myself in the mirror and say, well, what is the common denominator here in these, sort of relationships or situationships that are happening, right? And obviously, I'm the common denominator. So why is it I keep sort of attracting or getting involved with people who are not on the same wavelength as myself, right? And a lot of that was I didn't necessarily want to be alone, right? I wanted to have that person to text randomly throughout the day, so I would sort of get involved maybe in a relationship that wasn't for me, type of thing, right? And a lot of that, to your point, is sort of self-work. It's being okay with being alone with yourself. It's being okay with the low moments of really just having to look yourself in the mirror as much as you do not want to, right? And deal with all the bullshit that you've been sort of sweeping under the rug for years and years. So, I mean, let's talk a bit about what that looks like for you with the, building the relationship with self, right? And taking accountability and finding that self-love that I think so many people are lacking and haven't been taught how to properly do, essentially.
Yeah. For me, it was getting used to the thought of being by myself. I have been someone who has been in some sort of relationship or situationship since I was 14 years old. I'm turning 36 this year, so that's a long ass time,
Sure.
right? So after going through what I went through in that last relationship and almost losing my life once again, that was the knock upside of my head that I really needed to be like, stop. Like, this is God's way telling me, I need you to listen to me and I need you to start doing something differently, as uncomfortable as it is. And, taking a new path as opposed to, let me just download Tinder again and swipe right on someone else and then just start the whole bullshit cycle all over again. Like, no, I really had to get to the point of, and I'm still single now to this day. I've been single and celibate for 3.5 years. Like, I've been so focused on just getting to know me on my own because I never knew who I was outside of a relationship. I had no clue who Lianne was on her own. And that is something that I'm continuing to work on. And I think, that's the most important relationship that we all have, is the one that we have with ourselves. And that's the one that we tend to neglect the most, especially us women. I know there's people out there who can relate so much to this conversation that we're having, but I think it's so important for us to really embrace who we are outside of the roles that we play, the wife, the parent, the coworker, the sister, like, who are you at your core? And that's where the work needs to happen for you to answer those uncomfortable questions, to do things that make you happy. I've never taken myself out on a date before. Now I'm so comfortable with going out to the movies by myself, eating at a restaurant by myself. I couldn't do that shit before. But I'm doing things to make me happy now and be comfortable in my peace, in my solitude, and not have that be a burden like it used to be. You know what I mean?
Yeah, no. And I think when you're not comfortable with being by yourself, you end up making decisions based upon the short-term gratification rather than actually what's best for you, right? And I think even, it's kind of to what you're talking about with like identity almost, right? It's like how you are not your job, you're not your relationship, you're not any of those things. Who are you really when you don't have those things, right? And I think so many of us fail to sort of have that conversation, and that's why even beyond relationships, we end up in careers we don't like, right? We end up, living in places we don't find to be particularly, satisfying or fulfilling for us, whatever it might be, because we sort of are just abiding by this false identity that we've sort of just by proxy of life have just stepped into, essentially, right? And so many people get stuck in careers for so much longer than they need to be, because it's like, oh, if I'm not, Jimmy the engineer, who am I, right? Or what are my parents? My parents love telling their friends, my son's an engineer, right? And who am I if I don't have that sort of validation from them, right? And that is sort of where the self-work needs to come to place and say, I'm amazing and I'm me without any of these things, right? I'm so much bigger than the things that I do, or the people that I'm around. I'm this whole other entity of a person. You have to figure that out for yourself, and there's so much, power within that. And on the flip side of it, though, I'd love to kind of pick your brain as far as like, you go through a traumatic situation, right? That's incredibly difficult. You do years of work and ongoing work in really healing yourself and repairing those wounds and dealing with things that you hadn't dealt with even prior to that relationship, right? How then do you not allow yourself to be bitter towards the idea of the rest of your life, essentially, right? The idea of meeting somebody else, of not just saying, oh, all men are shit, I'm going to be alone for the rest of my life, right? Or if whatever the situation is, people are just bad people, I'm going to just be a hermit and not allow anybody else into my orbit at this point, right? How do you not go down that path of bitterness and essentially closing yourself off from life after experiencing something like what you did?
I'm so glad that you brought that up, because that's something that I'm experiencing now.
Sure.
There's definitely a fear that still lives within me of, what if I do meet someone like my ex all over again? Because it was beautiful in the beginning until it wasn't, right? And that's something that I'm actively working through, to not seclude myself from the world, especially when it comes to being in romantic relationships. Like, I do want to find my person. I do want to be in love. I'm a Virgo. I love being in love, right? But there is this still sense of like, damn, I really have to put myself out there if I want to make that happen. And that is a struggle for me. That's something that I deal with every day. And being someone who was still diagnosed with PTSD, post-traumatic stress disorder, I deal with the flashbacks. I deal with, reliving that trauma on a day-to-day basis. I still have the dreams. I still have these thoughts of, what if? The fact that my ex-boyfriend is getting out of prison this year is another level that I'm going to have to deal with. And it's real life. And I talk about all of that, the good and the bad. I'm very vulnerable with, not every day is rainbows and butterflies. And some days I'm depressed and I can't get out of bed. But, that's the part of the healing that I think it's so beautiful for us to be able to share the good and the bad, the bitter moments and the wonderful moments, right? That's something that we're going to go through day in and day out. But I think for me, like, just seeing the woman that I am now, despite what I've gone through, and I'm still here, like, I'm proud as fuck for that. And that's what I honor. That's what I celebrate. Even on the moments where I feel like I'm back at square one, even in the moments when I have a shitty dream and I'm thinking about this person, it's like, no, like, I survived what I went through and I'm here helping people just by sharing my story. I'm going to embrace the good and the bad that comes with it. And I hope others can do the same.
Yeah, no, and that's so beautiful. And I think empowering and also comforting, right? The idea that it's an ongoing process, and just because you read a self-help book doesn't mean it's all over, basically, right? And that you have it all figured out, which I think is like the sort of fairy tale ending that many self-help style things sort of sell us, is this idea of read this, take this course, boom, you're good to go, have fun in life now, and it's
only it was at that simple.
Right, exactly. It really is sort of this ongoing ongoing, process. And I'm staring at this quote you have behind you from Basquiat, right? It's not who you, what is it? Not who you are that holds you back. It's who you think you are not.
Who you think you are.
Right,
Yes.
right. I
Ooh, you know him?
Yeah,
He's one of my
course.
favorites.
Yeah,
I actually painted this myself.
Really? Wow, that's amazing. I actually have a Basquiat bracelet on. I went to go see an exhibit in the city.
I love it.
Yeah,
Great
yeah.
lines.
Yes. I mean, I feel like that's so fitting, kind of to your story and everything. I mean, why does that stick out to you in that way?
Yeah, I mean, just looking at that, it's us getting out of our own way, right? And that's someone who I used to be. I not used to, because I still can be my biggest critic.
Yeah.
All of us, we can be our biggest hater, our biggest naysayer, but like I said, just reflecting on who I was compared to who I am now, that's what I'm most proud of. And there's actually a quote right above this little thing right here that it says, I'm at peace with my past. And that's something that I'm still working through, but it's getting easier for me to accept what I've gone through and still celebrate who I've become despite the shit that life has thrown at me. You know what I mean? So it's a process, but one day at a time is what I like to say. Just take this one day at a time, embrace the ebbs and flows, as cliche as that sounds when it comes to the healing journey.
Yeah.
But, every single day forward is, a blessing in my eyes.
Yeah, no, absolutely. And on that like idea of really kind of like having the mentality of getting out of your own way and sort of declaring your strength, right? And declaring who you are for yourself. Do you think that people like your ex and I guess anybody who takes advantage of anybody in this world, like I kind of feel like, people can read us to a degree, right? And they can see if we aren't the type of person who has a strong conviction of who we are and what we won't tolerate, essentially, right? And I'm curious if you feel like that's sort of been your experience, especially as you talk about sort of the back-to-back-to-back types of bad relationships, if that was a part of it, that they could sort of read that maybe you were somebody that they could take advantage of in some sort of way.
Absolutely. I believe the type of people my ex is, and I don't want to throw out the word narcissist because that's very on trend nowadays.
Sure.
But he definitely had some qualities of being a narcissist.
Right.
But honestly, I was in a very low vibrational state in my life when I met him.
Yeah.
He was also, and it still is because I don't believe he's changed at all, but he was very also low vibrational. And that just connected us to each other. We were both very alone and longing for some sort of connection.
Right.
And me being an empath and leading with love, like I went into that relationship with love.
Right.
I went into it thinking, this is my forever, third time's the charm. I found the one and I gave him my all, and I think just being the type of person that he was, he took advantage of that. And there's a lot of people who are abusers who do fit that profile of like just getting what you need out of that person, and then when you no longer need it, they just get rid of you. And it's something that I had to work through, that I'm still working through again, like I said,
right,
of not being in that low vibrational, codependent energy, falling in love with potential, like we talked about before, ignoring the red flags and warning signs that I saw in the beginning of the relationship,
right,
but I chose to ignore.
Yeah.
That's where my accountability comes in. And it's a process that I'm grateful to have gone through, as crazy as it may sound, because it's created the woman that I am today.
Sure.
It's allowed me to change the standards that I did not have before. It's allowed me to grow the relationship that I've had with myself, but I had to go through that in order to learn from the experience. And sometimes you have to go through shitty things in order to hopefully learn from it.
Yeah, no, absolutely. I think sometimes, unfortunately, we need that bitter medicine, right? To like really get it and be like, okay, what the fuck am I doing to like bring this into my life consistently? Because I know there's a pattern there. There's something that I'm consistently projecting that is allowing this nonsense to be invited into my life almost, right? And let's go deeper into that idea of somebody's potential, right? 'Cause I did touch on that. And I've fallen victim to this as well, where it's, you see somebody and maybe they are just a nice person, but they are lacking in some sort of area, right? And I think we can get caught up in the fairy tale of it all, right? Especially with romantic relationships, and sort of ignore our own needs and sort of just keep giving them a free pass to do as they please, just because we think that eventually, they're going to figure it out and correct themselves, right? But I think this is obviously a toxic mindset. And you talk about, spending a lot of time on, seeing them for who they are rather than who they could be, essentially, right? So I'd kind of love to hear your perspective on that.
Yeah, it makes me think about the relationship that I was in before this last one. I
Yeah.
was in an almost 9 year long relationship with someone that was very toxic, breakup to makeup. And it was the same exact pattern, falling in love with their potential, creating this mindset of what could be as
Uh-huh.
opposed to taking it for what it was. And that's something that I was so used to doing. I repeated the same thing with my first relationship, which was with my daughter's father. And then the last one, that there were so many red flags, especially in the beginning with this person, that I just knew we were not compatible.
Yeah.
But I said, you know what? This feels familiar. So let me just stick around because this is what I'm comfortable with. This is what I know.
Right.
I know toxicity. I know bullshit. I
Yep.
know all of these feelings. This feels like home for me. So let me just stick around and play this out.
Right.
And that's something, it's a very toxic mentality to have. I don't recommend for anyone. But it's something that ultimately was very detrimental for me and my living, right? And I just think us women, especially, like, we have to stop pretending that these relationships that are unhealthy are anything but that. You know
Yeah.
what I mean? Like,
Yeah.
take it for what it is and stop painting this picture of like, oh, if I just love him a little bit more, then maybe it'll work. Or, if I do things to make him happy, but I lose myself in the process, then it's going to be the best relationship of our life. Like, no, fuck
Yeah.
that. You need to put yourself first.
Right.
You need to love yourself enough to walk away in the beginning when you see the red flags, when you have that inner knowing that's telling you, sis, something isn't really feeling
Yes.
right with this. Let's investigate this, as opposed to being like, oh, let's just try this again. You know what I mean?
Yeah.
It's exhausting to be in those types of relationships. So yeah, man, fuck the potential. Take the person
Yeah.
for what they are and believe the person. Like Maya Angelou said, believe someone the first time they show you their true colors.
Mm. Yeah, that's such a poignant kind of way to think about it. And it's also like, it's very societally it's like, okay, the woman, it's like you're supposed to mold the man into who you want him to be, right? That's been normalized. That's like passed down from generation to generation, or even particularly in our culture, right? Where you probably had I know my grandparents, it was like the idea of leaving the house didn't happen until you met a man, right? So everything you do to get at, like, everything you do is to meet a guy, to become a woman who is valuable enough that this suitor is going to want to take her out of her parents' house, right? So everything is placed in sort of this very toxic mindset around that just breeds misogyny, honestly, and toxic masculinity and all these different things. And we've normalized it, right? We've normalized ignoring your own intuition, because where's your value if you don't have if you don't have the husband, the house, the white picket fence, all these different things, right? And it's
Right.
it also, to your point, it leads us to, like, really, I think, not being able to know if we can trust our intuition, or even know when intuition is speaking to us, right? Because we're being reinforced all these societal norms and ideas that are really the opposite of what actually would give us real happiness in this life, And I'm obsessed with the idea of trying to hone my intuition, because I think that's the most difficult thing to really get a grip on, right? Because you can, especially if you're self-aware, you can begin to have this battle back and forth where you're like, am I projecting, or am I really, or something really off? Or, like, for me, I realized recently, it was like, oh, this is a combination of both. I am sort of projecting, but if the situation was sort of stable, I wouldn't be giving myself the opportunity to project, right? So I still have to find the intuition that is beneath the projection that's happening, right? And that's what's so fucking confusing about all of this, is like, which voice do I trust in my mind, right? And I feel like I wish there was like a clear cut answer that you could give people, like, of like, okay, this is the good voice, this is the bad voice, right? Like in television with the good angel and the devil on your shoulder, right? But that to me is sort of one of the complexities of being a human, is knowing what's your intuition, knowing what's trauma, knowing what's this or that. And I'm curious if you have any sort of vantage point of how you process those different voices that happen, that internal dialogue that happens.
Yeah, I love the self-awareness that you have. I think that's beautiful. And that's definitely a muscle that you have to work on your personal development
Sure.
journey, right? And talking about intuition, it makes me think about the relationship that we're talking about, the abusive one.
Yeah.
Before the physical abuse happened, a couple of months before, every single day I would wake up anxious. I would wake up with that feeling of, I feel like I have to throw up. My heart is racing. Something in my body does not feel right.
Yeah.
And I truly believe now, like, that was my intuition telling me, sis, this relationship ain't it.
Yeah.
Like, this shit is making you sick physically. And I think it's really important for us to listen to our body, listen to those cues that come up, whether you're in a relationship, whether you're, at a toxic work environment and you have a shitty boss, and like you're on your way to work, you feel anxious and like, oh, I hate going to work every single day, like
Right.
there's these cues that we tend to ignore and just maybe it's just I'm overthinking it, or let
Yeah.
me just pop a pill to numb that pain and not
Yes.
really deal with what's actually going on. But I think it's just having that acceptance and that awareness that you have to listen to and work through every single day. But yeah, man, for me, like, my body was telling me this is not right, you have to do something. And I mean, it took for me to almost die to be like, okay, let's listen now. But
Right.
it's just one day at a time, like I said before, just take it one day at a time.
Yeah, absolutely. And I'm glad you sort of brought up different scenarios, because I think regardless of who you are, what you're going through, these are all applicable practices, right? Like,
Yeah.
even in terms of like your job, if you're chronically burnt out, no matter how much sleep you get, or you're just not like following through on, the things that you used to enjoy, it doesn't mean you're lazy. Like I go to therapy and we talk about like, okay, well, what are the facts here, right? The facts are, I'm not a lazy person. I've busted my ass to build things. So if I'm not in that same mindset, maybe I've outgrown this particular situation, right? And that's the reality of it. That's why it's draining me. That's why it's exhausting me, right? And that is, your body physically dictating to you, something is wrong here. You need to hone in and address it. I mean, that's even,
Yeah.
I think you had her on your podcast, Dr. Marielle Bouquet, was talking about a situation where she was engaged and she was like breaking out into hives, like after she said yes to this engagement. And when she inevitably broke off the engagement, like the hives just stopped, right? And it was like her body was like having this visceral reaction to her sort of just living this life that wasn't for her with a person that she didn't want to be with. And I think, kind of to my point earlier of like a lot of the shit that we've been taught, we're not taught to listen to ourselves, right? We're not taught to go inward for advice or for healing or for any of those things. We're always taught to go outwards, right? To go get advice from somebody who doesn't know what the fuck they're talking about, right? Or that happiness.
Or to pray, just to go to church and pray.
Yeah, it's just fucking pray it away, right? Or just, whatever, go indulge in spending money or whatever it might be. Like any quick fix Band-Aid thing, right? That's what we're sort of taught, rather than just sit the fuck down and just listen for a second, right?
Yeah.
And I think that is, why so many of us find ourselves in various situations that really don't serve us. And it's not until something extreme happens that we're all of a sudden like, wait, what the fuck is going on right now? And that's I think the sad part about ours is that we have to go through these extremes, I think, to sort of sometimes get the message,
Yes, I can say that I'm a very hard-headed person.
Sure.
And I like things my way. And when they don't go my way, it's like the world is ending.
Yeah.
But God really had to shake me to my core in order for me to do something differently. And like I said before, I'm grateful for it now. Not when I went through it. I mean, I could
Sure.
have gone without going through what I went through, but I'm grateful for the lessons that I've been able to learn despite the ugly shit that I went through.
Yeah, of course. And last thing I want to touch on, because I think it's an interesting pivot, without knowing your background before podcasting. I know you said you had helped your sister out with her podcast behind the scenes and things like that, but even that sort of complete pivot that you've made into now being a creator and really, making it your life and your business to speak on this topic. What were you doing beforehand, and kind of what was that transition into where you are now?
Yeah, so I was working in the medical field. I was a medical assistant for a dermatology office,
Sure.
and I fucking hated it. I was miserable. I
Yeah.
just felt like, just another worker bee,
Uh-huh.
not really knowing what my purpose was, and just hating life, basically, just surviving, just going through the motions.
Yeah.
And, when I went through all of this, before I started the podcast, I actually was going to college, studying graphic design. As you guys can see, I'm a
Yeah.
very artistic person.
Yeah.
And this is a story that I love to share. This is actually what started me sharing my story. So there was an end of the year assignment for one of my classes, and we could do whatever we wanted. So I ended up painting a 24 by 36 painting of my story of surviving domestic violence.
Mm.
And I presented it to the class for my end of the year project. And that was the first time that I spoke about it publicly. Like, I worked with therapists, I was talking to people one on one
Sure.
in, life coaching. But the first time that I told strangers what I was doing using my art, and I got an A+, so I'm very happy
Nice.
about that. And at the end, people came up to me, my fellow students, and they were like, oh my God, this was so powerful. And one student, she actually was like, I grew up in a home that dealt with domestic violence. Thank you for sharing this, because I feel seen, I
Uh-huh.
feel heard, I feel understood. And there was, some students just looking at my painting and crying. And I was just like, holy shit,
Yeah.
like, this is amazing. I was able to talk about what I went through. I was able to use my art to express myself. I was able to do something that made me happy, and it made an impact. And after that, that's when I decided a couple months later, let's start the podcast, let's talk about it. And here we are today. So, yeah, I'm very proud of that.
Yeah, no, and I mean, and there's also like, there's a surrender that happens, right? Like, it's like you get the download essentially from the universe, God, whatever it is that you believe in, right? You have that moment where you do something, there's some sort of reaction to it, and something in you just sees everything completely differently than you did prior to that moment, right?
Mm-hmm.
And you can feel the energy, right? But then when you have a point where you can sort of like, it's like a fork in the road, right? Do I follow this energy? Do I keep trying to, dig deeper and see where else that I can go with that energy and how much more of it I can dig up? Or do you, what I think a lot of people sort of, they get in their own way where they start overthinking, and then the sort of energy, begins to dissipate almost, right? And you lose that door that opened just for a split second, right? And I think that's like, I don't want to talk about like, success or anything like that, but I do think when it's luck or whatever, divine timing, whatever it might be, I think it's the people who recognize the opportunity and saw that door is only going to be open for a split second. Let me go explore it, right? And that's what separates them from the people who maybe hesitated, kept thinking, and then the moment is passed almost, right? Or you lost that initial energy that was the fire you needed to actually get going, right? And it's hard to sort of recreate that, right? And I'm curious if there was anything that, anything you could lend to that, that speaks kind of further to that idea of like how you just sort of hit that at 100 miles an hour almost, after that moment. And we're like, fuck it, we're doing the podcast now. Like, I'm just curious if anything you could lend to anybody that might be at that moment or eventually finds himself at that moment where you feel something different happening. How do I take advantage of it?
You have to do the scary shit. Period. You have to get yourself out of your comfort zone because you don't grow. It's very cliche that people say that, right? But if you stay in only what you know, that's all that you know. You know, there's an entire universe out there waiting for you to step into that discomfort. Like this right here, this is very uncomfortable for me. You know, talking to you, Dramos, I know you're a big person and you have a huge following, but when this opportunity came into my hands, I said, fuck yes,
Sure.
because this is probably the only time that I'm going to be able to sit down and do this with you, right? So I think we just have to be able to get out of our own way, like we talked about before. Remember this quote right here.
Yes.
And what's the worst that can happen? I
Uh-huh.
think the worst thing that can happen is you living a life of regret and being like, damn, I wish I could have. What if?
Yeah.
I don't want to live a life of what could have been. I want to be able to say, I tried and maybe it didn't work out, but at least I gave it my all.
Yeah.
And you never know what can come from that unless you get out of your own way and just fucking do it. You
Yeah.
know, like I started from zero. I didn't know how to create a podcast.
Sure.
I didn't know how to paint. I didn't know how to do any of these things. But there was something inside of me, that inner knowing that we talked about, that inner voice. It kept coming back. It kept poking me in the side and being like, try it, do
Yeah.
it, see what happens. And I did it and I'm here. Dramos did it and he's here,
Yeah.
you know? And it's because we decided to be like, fuck that. I'm going to do it. And if it doesn't work out, that's okay. But at least I tried. So just
Yeah.
fucking do it.
No, I absolutely love that, and I agree with
Sorry,
that.
that's the Jersey coming out of me.
Nah, listen, I love it, because it's so true, and it's also, you know, I think what also makes us trip up is we think of everything we do in terms of like the grandiose like story of our life, right? And not everything it has to be thought about with like, listen, I podcast right now. I might not be podcasting in 10 years, right? And that's okay. I don't have to think about all that I'm doing right now in terms of what is this going to mean for me in 10 years? And that's where you start getting fucked up, where you're just like, well, is this something I want to do for 10 years? It's like, if it feels good now, then explore that and just have faith that you doing that will eventually lead to the next, right? And I think that's it's like whatever little things we could do to get out of our own way, right? Keeping these little mindsets, pushing through the bullshit, getting, the uncomfortable shit is part of it. You have to push past that and just stop overcomplicating it. If it feels good, if it's energizing you, that means there's something to be explored. And where it goes from there, who knows? But at least you can say, I did it. I went for it. I tried this one thing that was interesting to me, and there's no regret in that, right? No, regardless of how it turns out, there's no regret in saying at least I gave myself the opportunity to explore this one thing,
Yes, one day at a time, y'all.
Exactly. Listen, this has been amazing to finally get to sit down with you and have this conversation. Obviously the podcast is out there. You want to tell people where they can find it, all that good stuff?
Yes, thank you again so much for having me. This was a beautiful conversation. Anytime I'm able to share my story, I hope it reaches the people who need to hear it. So thank you for this opportunity.
Of course.
You can listen to my podcast. It's called Watch Us Thrive on all platforms, Spotify, Apple, YouTube. It's on YouTube as well. Every Tuesday, a new episode releases. One is coming out tonight at midnight. And you can follow my website, wutpodcast.com. All of my blogs are there. My episodes and all my social media links are there as well.
Amazing. And I know Gabriella is the lone survivor because everybody's been in and out with work stuff today. Not to put you on the spot, if you had anything you wanted to chime in, feel free, Gabriella. Not that you have to. If you don't have nothing, if you just want to listen, that's fine as well. But I always want to give the opportunity if there's any questions or anything you wanted to ask.
I just wanted to say that I just really appreciated being able to listen to this conversation, and I really resonated with it a lot. There were a lot of things that felt relatable to me in terms of like relationships and work and stuff. So just thank you for having this conversation and letting me listen in.
Thank you for being here.
All right, so I'm gonna just pause here one more time. We'll take a quick break and then we'll have the rest with Lianne Torres. Well, I thank you so much for sharing your story, just this conversation in general. For anybody following along at home, we are recording this live as a part of the Just Be Social Club. This is one of our expert calls that we like to do. So we do have a live virtual audience here. So I'm going to open it up to just a couple questions from people listening in the via Zoom here, and we'll do it as a part of our Ask a Gringo segment.
Ask a Gringo.
I have a question. And also, I think Brent left us a question. It was, what recommendation do you have for any women who might find themselves in a violent situation, acknowledging that violence can be more than physical, and so who hasn't really told anyone or might be feeling stuck or alone? You know, they haven't shared it with anybody around them.
Yeah. Tell one person. When I told my best friend that night, I had all those feelings of, oh my God, what's going to happen if I tell someone what's going on? But that she literally saved my life. She was the reason why I called 911. So what I would tell someone, you're in this type of relationship, you know what you're going through, honor that, know that you're not crazy. You know, they're going to try and gaslight you. They're going to try and make you feel guilty. They're going to, instill fear in you. If you say something, I'm going to do this, but tell one person. You only need one person in your corner, even if it's a stranger on the internet, even if it's me. Like, my DMs are always open, especially on Instagram, but please just let one person know, because that can literally save your life. And you don't feel the shame, don't feel the embarrassment. All of that is normal, but it's important to lean on that support, because you don't have to go through this alone. You shouldn't feel like you have to go through this alone. So please find the power within you to speak up and tell someone what's going on.
That's beautiful. So thank you again for all that you're doing, first and foremost, and it's incredibly important work. So I thank you for doing this and for being on the show. It's always good to connect, and especially I think as a man, I think it's important to be able to hear these conversations, and be an ally as well, as much as I possibly can be. So I thank you for giving me the opportunity to do so.
Yes, I appreciate you. Thank you so much.
Of course. So yeah, we'll stay connected, and thank you again. We'll talk soon. Man, big shout out to my guest this week, Lianne Torres, for being a part of the Just Be Social Club, our mastermind groups that we have. She was our expert call this month, which is a part of what we do with the Just Be Social Club. In addition to the monthly mastermind, we usually have a bi-monthly, I think I was saying monthly, but it's bi-monthly expert call. So we'll just have various creatives or experts from their perspective world and give you the opportunity to sit in on like a live podcast recording, and then also participate in the conversation, ask questions and comment and just pick people's brains who maybe are doing things that you aspire to do, or, are just inspiring to you in some way that you feel like maybe you could get something from them. So that's another part of the Just Be Social Club that we love to do, is like, I really want to make this interactive, where I introduce you to people that are doing amazing work, or maybe people you're already a fan of, and give you the opportunity to have access to them, and I think that's an incredibly special thing. So that's what we're doing with the Just Be Social Club. Again, we're soft launching the sort of new bigger group, as far as it being a bit more streamlined of a process. So we're doing like a friends and family right now. You want to be a part of that, just DM me at DJ Dramos on Instagram, or go to or email actually Brenda at mindofayounglord.com if you want to as well. Either one is easy enough and works for us. Now with that said, let's tie everything we talked about today in a neat little bow in a segment we call Conclusion Stew.
Time for Conclusion Stew.
All right, so I'm just moved by that conversation, and I think, I love, and this is going to sound weird, but I love her really declaring, like, the fact that in a weird way, right, she's grateful for the experience because of all that she gained from it. And obviously, nobody wants to go through violence or abuse or trauma, right? So I want to make it very clear, we're not, lessening the effects of that, right? But I think zooming out, having a more sort of, I don't know if existential is the right word, but just a larger conversation here, taking out the specifics of her story and insert whatever trial and tribulation you've been through, there really is something beneficial about all the bullshit that we go through in this life. And it doesn't feel like it in the moment. Shit, sometimes years later, you're still like struggling to make sense of it all. But the resiliency and sort of just like beyond knowledge, just I think there's some maturity that happens. I think wisdom is probably the word I'm looking for. The wisdom you gain from the ups and downs of life is invaluable. And listen, it's fucking brutal. You know, there are times where I'm like, God, I feel like if we could do this whole lesson without the pain and disappointment, I genuinely appreciate it, because I don't know if I could keep being one of your tough little soldiers, you know? But I can truthfully say, like, looking back on my own story, and I'm not comparing it to anything we've talked about today, but without a lot of the bullshit I went through as a kid or continue to go through now, I don't think I'm here talking to you. I don't think I have a story to really tell. I don't think that I'm able to push through the difficult moments that life throws at me without the muscle that was built from the trials and tribulations, right? And I appreciate Lianne sort of giving me a shout out on self-awareness. But yeah, I don't have that self-awareness without going through the bullshit, right? And even I mentioned in a relationship setting, right? I was talking about being like triggered, you know, by somebody that I had been kind of seeing, and having this internal dialogue of like, am I just blowing something out of proportion, right? And it's because I've gone through a bunch of bullshit and not trusted myself and been hurt and let down as a result, I'm able to actually slow down in the moment and say, yes, maybe I'm blowing this exact situation out of proportion, but the trigger coming from my intuition is a very real thing, right? That existing is a sign that something is off. Even if I could say I'm reading too deep into something, right? Like whatever, for the sake of example, they said something, I'm reading too deep into it, they didn't mean it, right? But just the very fact that maybe I'm feeling a little bit off in general, there's something to be said about me not getting something, or maybe there not being a certain level of trust, or I'm not getting a certain something from that person that is allowing me to be susceptible to my own imagination, essentially, right? There's something there. And again, that doesn't necessarily mean it's like, oh, that's something there, I need to walk away from this. It just means, hey, this is something for you to pay attention to and try to address why I'm even susceptible to like this sort of red flag or this sort of trigger, right? And again, that's years of going through shit, ignoring it, having your heart broken, being disappointed, to now saying like, oh, this is coming from a real place, right? I felt this way before, I ignored it, and it led me here, right? So now I can learn from that mistake. And that's sort of a long-winded, sort of silly example of this whole thing. But again, it's those life experiences that allow us to make better decisions moving forward and allow us to be more in tune with our emotions and our intuition and life as a whole and what we want out of it, right? We have a clearer definition of what we do and don't want based upon the shit that happens to us, right? And that's not to cheapen the experience or to diminish the levels of trauma that certain experiences will dump on us. But there is something empowering about knowing that I will be better at the end of this, right? I will be a stronger, better, more resilient person, more apt to dealing with life at a higher level as a result of this setback, of this trauma, this negative experience, right? And I find that to be incredibly empowering. And I think the other thing, we've touched on this in previous episodes with other guests, but you know, the idea of letting people just show you who they are, right? You can't change people. People only change for, you know, themselves essentially, right? And that's not a, you know, negative, you know, sort of I'm not throwing shade at anybody. We're all like that. Real change comes from us truly recognizing a problem and then addressing it because we believe in it, right? That's why we're able to do the work, is because we believe it's worth the effort, because we're seeing, a real issue here. And I think oftentimes business partners, friendships, relationships, family members, we're so obsessed with the idea of who they could be, of seeing their potential, of molding them, who do we want them to be, that we stay in situations that are no longer serving us, or we ignore our own happiness for the sake of making them comfortable because we see their potential, right? And we don't want to hurt them, right? Because we know that they're a good person at heart, or whatever it might be. Or we sort of, I don't know, we really just like refuse to see what's in front of us. We think they can change, whatever it might be. And you really have to just be okay with accepting people where they are, and from that, deciding, do they have a place in my life or not? Because as we talk about with a lot of things, like, there's only but so much you're in control of. I can't control this person not doing the work, not wanting to hold the mirror up to themselves, right? Regardless of if I love them, I see them as a great person, whatever it might be, whatever history we have. If they refuse to do the work, I have to decide, can I accept them as a part of my life as they are right now? Is it healthy? Is it something that is within my boundaries, right? And if the answer is no, you have to sort of be okay with separating from that person or that situation, I think. And that's a lot of sort of what we touched on today as well. People will show you who they are, and while you can't control that, you can control whether or not they have a place in your life at the end of the day. And I think that's so empowering if you allow it to be, right? If you allow yourself to embrace that and not be disappointed by that fact, but instead recognize it as a valuable tool for you to live the type of life you want, surrounded by the type of people you want. I think that's when you begin to really set out on a more fulfilled and purposeful life, because you're not accepting anything less than what you feel like you deserve, right? And I think that's what we all are striving for. And then lastly, what I'll say, when you talk about our community, everything is so hush-hush, right? We don't talk about family business outside and things like that. Well, I think to a degree, there's value in that, right? And not oversharing amongst strangers and things like that. I believe it also, in cases like Lianne's, could be detrimental to your health by not asking for help, right? Not saying, being too afraid to admit that you can't handle this on your own, right? The pride, the ego that comes into play, the admission of mistake, or even just the admission of a bad situation, or just the embarrassment that we often unnecessarily feel because a situation is uncomfortable, right? And we maybe, feel guilty in some sort of way, so now we're embarrassed. And there's no shame in talking to somebody, right? I love how she said, if you are in one of these situations, the first thing she would say is tell at least one person, right? I think if there's so much power in sharing your truth and being vulnerable, and I can't stress that enough. My life has changed drastically, not because I started working harder, but because I just began owning my truth and getting better and better at being vulnerable and sharing it. And that bled into the way I carry myself in public, the way I dress, all these different things. It allowed, the type of people I'm going to have around me, the type I'm not going to have around me, right? It just continues to lend itself into all aspects of my life. But it started with me sharing my truth and me owning it and releasing all of the shame that I felt around it, right? There's something so incredibly empowering in that and in vulnerability in general. So just, I don't know, great conversations all around. Salute to Lianne for hopping on. Again, it's the Watch Us Thrive podcast. Go check that out wherever you find podcasts. And with that said, I will see you on Thursday with a brand new episode, our Thursday Trends episode. You want to join the Just Be Social Club, you want to ask about it, DM me, email Brendan at mindofyounglord.com. We're having conversations like this on a consistent basis, bringing the community together. So it's really amazing, and I'd love to have you be a part of it. But that's it. Catch you on Thursday. Till then, stay safe. We'll talk soon. Peace.